to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by RealAgriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
Well, the ways that farmers receive new information that can be put into action at the farm level have evolved greatly over the decades. Sure, in-person meetings and presentations will always be a thing, but there have been some big changes that have come about, mainly as a result of new communication tools becoming more common. Smartphones, for example, podcasts, Google, YouTube, and so on. There are now artificial intelligence platforms, some based off of ChatGPT, designed specifically to answer questions, distill information, and make recommendations about agronomy, livestock management, and more. And that brings up the big question, what will or should agricultural extension look like in the future? Where should investments be made? Who should be making those investments? Those are some of the questions that we're going to explore as we want to welcome you to this latest episode of the Ag Policy Connection podcast, brought to you by the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, or CAPI, and RealAgriculture. I'm your host, Kelvin Hepner, and we're going to be breaking down, exploring what the future of extension could look like with our panel of three guests. First up, we have Joy Agnew, who is the Vice President of Research at Olds College in Alberta. Joy is certainly quite familiar with extension work and the practical application of research in Western Canada. We also are pleased to welcome Adharal Chowdhury. Adharal is an associate professor in capacity development and extension at the University of Guelph in Southern Ontario. He was just last month, I found this out, named president of the Association for International Agricultural and Extension Education. So certainly bringing a global perspective when it comes to this discussion about extension. And rounding out our panel, we're pleased to welcome Jake Legui. Jake farms near Fillmore, Saskatchewan in the southeast part of the province. He's also a director with the Saskatchewan Wheat Development Commission, or Sask-Wheat. And we start our conversation talking about this word extension, what it means and why it's important. On this episode of the Ag Policy Connection, we're focusing on the future of extension and knowledge transfer in agriculture, and we're pleased to welcome our three panelists. We have Adharal Chowdhury of the University of Guelph, Joy Agnew at Olds College, and Jake Legui, farmer based in Saskatchewan and a director with Sask-Wheat. Thank you, all three of you, for taking time from your busy schedules to join us here on the Ag Policy Connection.
Thanks for the invite.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting.
Let's start with kind of defining extension, what we mean by this term in an agricultural context. Joy, why don't we start with you? What do you see the word extension and the function of extension being?
Sometimes it depends on the day, I guess. There is no real well-defined solution or answer, I guess, to that. But in my opinion, it's really at its core, it's getting information, the right information in the right format into the hands of the people that can actually use it to make good management decisions. And so that comes in a whole bunch of different forms. And like I said, depending on the type of farm or farming production system, that might even look a little bit different. But it's all about just getting good information, practical information into the hands of the people that can use it.
Adharal, in your role, you've had some experience working in extension or watching extension happen globally. Why is it important, and how do you see it? What do you see as the core function of extension?
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to add what Joy mentioned. Like extension, for me, is not only about transferring information, it's more than this. So information is an important element, but then when you actually transfer the information, how the information is being used, that's also part of the extension. So transferring information is something, which more resonate to me is more science communication, for example, right? But extension is, for me, is more broader than this. And in the past, let's say from now 20 years or 30 years back, we thought extension as a like a connection between research and farmers. But now it's more than this, because in agriculture now there are not only research, extension, and farmers. Think about like the fertilizer input dealers, right? Think about like technology provider, especially digital technology provider. So extension have to play as a brokering role of information that being, yeah, for generated in research, but also in other sources, and help farmers to make, informed decisions. But that decision is not only based on information. It's more than this. It's related to policy. It's related to what's happening around the community, right? It's more than this.
Jake, how about from your perspective as a grower, where do you or what do you see as extension in your interaction with extension and the value it provides to you?
Yeah, I think, in that context, I guess I would think about it as something pretty simple. It's just how do I get access to information in the scientific literature and in government policy and all of these things to do the best job that I can on my farm? How do I take that information and make it useful? That's the role. That's what I think extension is, for as far as the way I understand it, is that connection between me and government, literature, scientists, all those parties.
So I think you're still in the young farmer category, but you've probably seen some changes and some trends in terms of how extension works. Can you make any or share any observations there in terms of how you differences you've noticed over the last decade or two?
Yeah, it's honestly, in some ways, it's lessened. I would say from the government point of view, our ministry office has a smaller role than it used to have. I don't know if that was intentional or just a slow erosion of, government funding that seems to be an issue in a lot of places. But I would say at the same time, we've had a significant increase in extension services from, professional agronomists and people that our farm and a whole pile of other farms and friends and neighbors rely on. Yeah, we pay these individuals to help our farms out, but it's good value because we can take what they're saying and actually apply it directly to what we're doing, rather than sort of more the generalized extension services that often comes from government. This is much more specific. And I would also say that there's been more of an effort from, crop commissions like SAS Wheat, for example, just to give ourselves a shameless plug here. We've got, we've really stepped up a lot of the extension work that we're doing to try and fill that gap, because I would say that we've realized it is a bit of a gap, that farmers don't have access to the same extension services that they might have had access to, 2 decades ago.
Yeah. Joy, Jake just talked about the perceived, at least, decline, and in some cases it is a very real decline in public investment in extension work. So we have this public versus private shift, or public versus to commodity organization, where it's still a shared cost among a large group. How do you see that looking in the future in terms of how this communication happens, how this information is made available to farmers in terms of that public versus private approach?
Yeah, the role of government in ag knowledge transfer and ag extension is definitely a hot topic in Alberta right now. As I would say, it's less of a slow erosion, and it was just a massive cut a couple of years ago. So definitely lots of discussion over the last couple of years about how to bring that back together, or provide that extension service back to Alberta producers, and still a work in progress. I know there's been a lot of discussion about a sort of a public-private partnership, or a standalone not-for-profit entity to try to coordinate extension services in Alberta. But similar to Saskatchewan, a lot of the producer associations or producer groups here, and even agronomists are trying to fill that gap. But the challenge with that is that it's now not coordinated in any way. There's not sort of a long-term strategy or plan on how to do that really effectively. And by kind of disjointing it and sort of pushing out the responsibility now to not-for-profit entities, or sometimes even for-profit entities, it's putting the entire structure at risk, and producers are definitely wondering where to go to get reliable, unbiased, good information to make decisions.
So, at Harl, when we look at the benefits, there is a public good or a broader societal return on investment from investment in extension, but at the same time, governments are facing fiscal constraints, and it's a challenge to for them to. This is an area where there isn't an immediate electoral consequence if they cut investment to extension. How do you see this unfolding in terms of the value versus who pays model of extension in the future?
Yeah, I think extension is still is very relevant for public sector investment. Unfortunately, I mean, I take the uh, you know blame like for probably it's easy to take blame on us like as a scholarly community. We probably didn't do much, and extension in Canada, across Canada, like especially extension education has died out, right? And in whole Canada, only University of Guelph provide a graduate degree, which we call capacity development extension, and we are still struggling. So I'm talking about from an educator perspective. So that is, I think, has been absence for a long time. And then, when education is there and those we produce like or we create new generation of professionals, they work in different sector, right? They also influence policy, right? And so that's not happening, right? Um, I am hearing about Alberta, it's same in Ontario too. There is, less support for public funding for extension. But I think to me, like we are probably not going to like 20 years back in Canada when we enjoyed, uh, public sector extension. But I think it's important for everyone, for farmers, for educators, for, advisors, right? To actually advocate for that support and so that government actually can be serious about that and make more public private partnership. So I'm saying like private sector is still important, but I think public sector is has to play a role, especially as Joy mentioned about like when you consider about unbiased information. And that's another challenge we are also looking at in my research about agri-food misinformation, because information is now intentional. That is, so in that context, I think it's important, and we probably, I don't know, we'll also talk about probably artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. But I think with growing concern and also the opportunities, it is more important than ever that, public sector, government, whether federal government or provincial government, pay more attention than they did maybe in last 15 or 20 years.
Jake, why does this matter though? Farmers' bottom lines are doing okay in many cases, despite governments not investing in extension, and often there's been criticism of publicly funded extension resources not always being the most current or the latest, like often maybe a little bit behind in terms of research or researching things that many farmers have already adopted. Those types of criticisms are sometimes shared. Do we need to return to the extension model of 20 years ago when there was an ag rep or a extension person in every region of the province, or can we shift to more of a private funded model, or what do you see in terms of providing the most value to your farm going in the next 5-10 years?
Well, you've raised some important points there, Calvin, in that, farming has changed a great deal. And, we have access to information that farmers never had access to 15, 20 years ago. I think we have huge reliability problems, especially when it comes to something like AI. Um, you know, I guess just ahead of the meeting here, I asked ChatGPT, what would be a good way to run a fertilizer program for durum wheat in the dark brown soil zone in southeast Saskatchewan. And one of its suggestions was to uh, ban and incorporate phosphorus and potassium ahead of seeding, which wouldn't exactly be a great practice. But, it'll hallucinate answers that, to questions that it doesn't have information for. Now, services like this are the worst they're ever going to be. They're going to get better. But for the next while, we have a serious reliability problem with something like that. And I would also say that, as a farmer, it is very difficult to try to, sort through the volume of information available online today. It's very difficult to find things that are actually applicable to my farm. It's very difficult to search, and find enough detail to be able to do that. But there are services popping up that are helping with that, like Bruce Barker's Canadian Agronomist is a good site I've found for, dissemination of information. We have a great professional agronomist that we work with on our farm that's always looking through all of this information and helping us determine what works for us on our farm. And I would also say that governments have agendas and agendas change. We've seen a significant, very significant focus on climate change in the past several years. And, our extension services have focused mainly on helping farmers apply for the off-calf program and how to, use practices that really aren't applicable for us in this part of the world, like cover cropping and those sorts of things. So one of the issues with extension is that even though it's public, it doesn't mean it can't be biased towards a certain thing. And I think that's what we've been seeing. Having said all that, I do think that there is still a role for extension services. Certainly in the realm of programs like off-calf, if there's government funding available for doing different things, it is really useful for us to have somewhere that can sort of centralize that information and help with application of these programs, although the government ended up using different groups to do it anyway. So I guess for me, when I'm looking forward to what information I'm going to need on my farm, I'm always going to need some sort of a connection between my farm and the scientific community to be able to take what they're learning and apply it to my farm. What form that takes, I guess, isn't as important to me as it is that we get it, whether it's the crop commissions that are doing it, which are, significant government funding goes into those as well, whether it's extension offices in my local city like Weyburn, or whether it's some combination of all that. I think there's always going to be a role for public investment in extension. But I don't think we need to go back to what it used to look like. I think we need to adapt and evolve and fit government funded extension into the environment that we have today and not try and go backwards. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, Harold, Jake talks about this information problem, just the overwhelming amount of information that's out there and some of the ways of screening it or filtering it. And I would say, put a plug in here, I would say media is also, and a website like Real Agriculture or Real Ag Radio or podcasts are a format too of or one example of, and in many ways, I think that's what our function is in the media, agriculture media world. Harold, do you see artificial intelligence, the ChatGPT models, like Jake says, they can only get better from here? Do you see that being a model of disseminating information, distilling it into a useful format, this overwhelming amount of info, getting it into a meaningful, actionable message to a farmer at the end of the day? Do you see that down the road?
Yeah, I see there is a good, like a prospective future for using AI, but the question is that how we plan that future. So I mean, if we think about it, is another tool that will automatically actually provide information, right information based on the technology itself. I think there is a real danger. I think it has to be taken as a process. So what I mean, as the technology evolve, we need to also critically ask question about, right, the ethics as well as, the context of information being shared, right? Like fertilizer application in Saskatchewan and in Ontario has a very context-specific kind of practice, right? And so, I mean, it has to be adapted to the local needs. So, I mean, the technology is there, but those technology has to be adapted to the location specific. It's not like a ChatGPT. There are some generic kind of thing. Agriculture is not a generic thing. I mean, when I lived in many places of the world, it's same corn you produce in different ways, right? I mean, the science and culture, agriculture also has a culture aspect of the practice. So, to briefly respond to that question, I think the media researcher, advisor, as well as a farmer, has to, I mean, we should not reject AI because of their negative consequences. I think we need to embrace, but more responsible way. And that's, I think we see it's a good future and more, sustainable future through AI we can create, especially when it comes to, advising or enhancing advisory service.
Joy, what's your perspective? We are seeing companies coming out with agronomy AI models, large based on ChatGPT or similar type large language model frameworks. Do they have a fit already, or how close are they to being relevant in terms of what you see? And of course, in Olds College, you're doing all kinds of work with different companies and different technologies and sensors and different data input information networks and that type of thing.
Yeah, there's definitely a role for AI. I mean, the main value proposition of AI is taking massive quantities of sort of disparate information and pulling it together in a way that makes sense, right? But as has been already previously mentioned, the regionality and the specifics get lost, I guess, in AI interpretation today. But the other piece of it is historically, farmers working with agronomists or trusted advisors. It all comes down to that trust piece as well. So we need region specific information, not just the broad strokes of, here's an interpretation of everything that is related to fertilizer management. It needs to be region specific, and there's still some degree of trust required between a farmer and the information provider, right? So that's why I think the human element is still always going to be a key part. But where AI and tools like AgVisor Pro and ChatGPT and these other pieces are going to be important going forward, but there still needs to be that trust element as well.
Yeah, and some level of transparency. Jake talked about different extension resources in the past already. Everybody has a bias inherently. AI there will need to be some transparent level of transparency to develop that trust as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, do you see a place? So this is I'm going to use an example here in media and journalism. I think a lot of media companies are wrestling with what AI is going to mean for their business, and I'm convinced that in the future, new information, AI won't be great. You'll still have value placed on new information and new findings and new research. And do you see the same in agriculture when it comes to the role of AI? You're still going to need that original primary data to be developed somewhere. AI likely isn't going to be coming up with that. Is that a fair comment, Joy?
Absolutely. That's why I feel like ag research is such an exciting place to be because we're never going to answer all the questions, or we're not going to have all the answers to all the questions that the ag sector has. So there's always going to be a need to generate new information and generate new findings and new results for the various engines, whether it's artificial intelligence or otherwise, to combine that and compile that in a way that again can be used by producers to make good management decisions to improve overall productivity and sustainability.
Yeah, and we're talking about these AI models as if they are futuristic or like just cutting edge right now. But Google, Jake, I'm sure you've Googled, searched for information in the past and come up with extension resources via a search engine in the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, the technology is changing incredibly quickly, but the specificity is still a huge issue, as Adderall mentioned. I mean, I can Google anything that I want, and I can come up with stuff that's from the United States, from Africa, from India, and somewhere maybe after you click more results 20 times, maybe you get an article from Saskatchewan. It's really difficult to actually be able to delve in and find information, just as a farmer, like just trying to find basic information online is actually really difficult. And I would say it's becoming more difficult. The search engines don't seem to be, they seem to be optimizing the wrong direction, I guess, for us to be able to find specific information that works for us. So yeah, I mean, like you mentioned earlier, sites like Real Agriculture and others like that are helpful because it's somewhere you can go rather than having to just do a direct search. So there is a huge value and an important part that sites like that play. We need Canadian-based sites like RealAg and others like it to be able to provide that more of a central hub of information.
Yeah. Harl, when you look around the world, in terms of the future of knowledge transfer and extension and having farmers understand why maybe changes need to be made in practices or how that could improve their bottom lines, what do you see as the future of this topic? Are there certain models that you see being more successful and that you see us moving towards here in Canada as well, based on what you've seen in other countries?
Yeah, I mean, in that case, it's a good question, but probably a very discrete answer would be like between developing and developed world, what I've seen. In developing world, if you go to India or maybe some African countries, you will certainly see how extension is still, I would say, lifeblood of agriculture and agricultural development. And because there is more and more smallholder lives there, right? And when I lived in Europe and working in North America, it's more industrialized agriculture, and you see that more large farmer is there, right? And I don't know much history, but I mean when I read the history and I had the feeling like with the industrialization, with the what I say more corporate kind of agriculture, like the roles of extension for some reason, in the discourse has lost, right? But think about like we also have a smallholder here, right? We are also talking about climate change. We are also talking about sustainable agricultural practices. So the corporate model, I'm not, like I don't want to criticize the privatization model. I think it has its own value, but one thing we need to understand that it has a profit tied in. It has a gain tied in, right? A financial gain. So it has to play in that role, but the public, responsibility for government and other people or policymaker need to understand that, we need to also think about those like who are smallholder, those who are working in climate smart practices, right? So in that case, I think it's important to think about that role. And I see the differences, as you're saying, like in some countries in Europe, for example, like if you go to Western Europe, you will see more kind of what we have seen in Canada. Like there is a less role of private sector. But if you go to Eastern Europe, you see still the government role is very important. Some country like New Zealand, for example, is highly privatized, right? And in Australia, like in that region, like neighboring countries, like there is still like the same kind of trend, like we have still public-private kind of extension. So our neighbor, US, still, like that model, land grant system that we never had, but we somehow followed in early 1990s, right? And they also moved to privatization, but still retain land grant system. And I found like that still works, still very important. And we need to think about how we can bring back this discussion with research extension and farmers network in a some kind of private platform, I think in Canada.
Joy, what do you see in terms of that setup in Canada in the future? Of course, in Alberta, you've seen major changes where the province withdrew, and that load has shifted to commodity groups, and colleges like Olds College are picking up some of it, and I think you're still trying to figure it out, like you said before. But how do you see that split being set up in the future? At Harl talked about in the U.S. land grant universities still, that model still continuing to this day. Canada, it seems like we've seen more evolution, or there's been a lot of change in the last decade or two. How do you see that going forward?
Yeah, it remains to be seen, I guess. But we're at an interesting point where, like has been mentioned already, that we need to evolve. We don't need to replicate the type of extension models that we had 10, 20 years ago. There's different realities, different tools, just a different reality, right? So I think this shift in Alberta specifically is probably well timed, because we need to think through things a little bit differently. One thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to analyze over the last little bit is looking at, because the ultimate, I guess, outcome or measure of success for extension could be related to adoption rates of best practices and use of technologies. So if we're looking at historically with the old model, looking at adoption rate of something transformational like conservation tillage, it took 30 years to get from adoption rate of 0 or 10% up to 80 or 90%. And there was, the extension model of the day was very much hands-on, very much regional specific. There was specialists in every area, and conservation learning centers and places like that for producers to go get information and learn about this new practice. And it took 30 years. If we're looking ahead and looking at, production targets and emission reduction targets and things like that require adoption of best practices in the 80 to 90 range, where we're currently at 20 to 30%, how can we accelerate that adoption? How can we change the way that we generate and share information? And then the flip side of extension is also, researchers and various groups getting information back from producers around what questions do they still have, what type of research or projects or activities or demonstrations need to be done in order to answer the questions that are still out there. So how can we change that entire reality to try to accelerate adoption and try to accelerate improving productivity and sustainability? So we don't know what it's going to look like. Like I said, there's a lot of discussion happening in Alberta, and every region, every province seems to do it a little bit differently. So there's lots of interesting models to look at to say, hey, what do we need here in Alberta? But it's probably well timed, and we can really change the way that extension is done, hopefully for the better, and really help producers best maximize the value of that information.
It is probably an ever-changing process. It's something that we're probably going to be continually evaluating what works best as technology changes, as information, ways of communicating change, and all of that. Jake, in your role as a director at Sask Wheat, you're a commodity organization that has invested in extension resources, possibly in reaction to a provincial government funding less than it used to, or maybe it's just driven by demand. Maybe take us behind the scenes there in terms of the conversation at the Sask Wheat board level. How do you decide how much or whether to invest in extension for wheat growers in Saskatchewan?
Yeah, we saw it as a gap. Extension services aren't what they were. So we thought, maybe a service that we could provide farmers would be to try and fill a little bit of that gap. So, we did put a bit of more of a focus on, adding some services like an on-farm trial program. There's thousands of products out there and practices that farmers can try each and every year, and it's so difficult for us to figure out what to even look at, what to even consider doing a test on in our own farms. At least with a program like this, and the other commissions are doing it too, you can compile replicated data from farms, spread out across the province, and hopefully get a much faster turnaround on whether a product or practice works. And we've also tried to target farmers where they are, podcasts, doing very informal type meetings or coffee shop talks, those sorts of things where we're not doing a bunch of big presentations, just chatting with farmers. I mentioned earlier at the beginning that extension is a connection between farmers and researchers and policy and all of that. That means it goes both ways. I think Joy raised a good point. Farmers are often ahead of the research community on things that they're trying, things that they're experimenting with. And I think it's important sometimes for the research and government community to recognize that. And sometimes farmers are the innovators. And, sometimes we might be trying something that sounds a little strange, but 20 years down the road, sometimes it takes things over. I mean, it was early adopters that first tried no-till. That's where it first came from. So I think we just have to make sure that we're, as an extension community, you're meeting farmers where they are, and not trying to force, a certain way of presenting information, towards them, is giving them information in a way that they can use it, which often means mobile. It doesn't mean going into a government office. It doesn't mean going into town hall meetings. It means that while I'm sitting in the sprayer or the air drill or driving my truck down the highway, I can access information that's relevant to me and that's understandable to me. So that's something that at Sask Wheat that we've tried to do. And I think that the extension, network would benefit from looking at a lot of those things. And I think that is happening. But that's kind of where I see it, I guess, when I put my farmer hat on. I need accessible information that meets me where I am.
Yeah. I think part of that accessibility too, and this is maybe one of the final themes we'll discuss here, is communication skills in the science community and in the research community. When you look at successful examples of extension, I find, at least to me, individuals, personalities come to mind, individual people that were a force for something that they were passionate about, and they communicated it well. Ada Harl, is that something that in the academic community you see there being a need for more emphasis on communication skills and having that ability to take that first step of converting research and distilling it into a message that resonates with the intended audience?
Yeah, Kelvin, is a nice question. I have to say, as a researcher, we are the worst communicators. And I think we need more and more skills and tools and techniques to become, better communicator, and I would say effective communicator. If time allows, I'd like to also respond a few things about what Jake and Joy mentioned.
Sure, go ahead.
And one thing is, I really appreciate your idea of Jake about farmers' innovation. And I was just thinking about the way we think about research extension knowledge is like top down. I mean, it should not be top down. I mean, farmers has a lot of innovation and because farmers use the research and adapt it, right? And in extension has an important role to advocate that innovation. It's not the researcher, right? And for the impact assessment, I think what Joy mentioned is very important. Adoption is a very important component, but typically we think about extension as a return on investment. And there is two study I know, one study shows that extension, based on 20 observation, extension actually gives 70 percent of return of investment in when comparing with other research. So it's based on the prevalent adoption, but extension plays a huge role in terms of community development, in terms of what is information load Jack is talking about. There's so much information and how I can make informed decision, right? And extension is also part of releasing stress, like mental health for farmers, because the connection is important. And that connection should not be always virtual connection. There should be a human connection all the time. So what I wanted to say here, that there is a technical aspect of thinking about impact assessment for extension, that is adoption is always, or economic return, but also there is a functional and social aspect of extension, which is always get, unrecognized. And I think it has a lot of value. And if you really, I don't know if there is any formula, if you can calculate in terms of, monetary value, you will see extension has even more value on that aspect. If there is no extension, in that days, farmers will still can operate, find the information through AI, through social media or whatnot on their personal, consultant. But that aspect you can never be replaced, and that gets recognized. So I just wanted to contribute. I was just thinking it's very important that people know that. And I think that your question is about science communication. I think is very important, and especially also penetration of artificial intelligence. It is, as I said, I don't want to say the negative thing. It can be very scary. I was reading to Warren Buffett comments about like AI will be a next century's beast, right? Of course, I think he thought about that because you see like the way AI now is being used, there is a more risk of misinformation and disinformation, right? So as a science communicator, as a researcher, if researcher doesn't understand how these tool being used and how tool can be used responsibly, I think that there is a real danger in terms of even science communication. So in the past, it was important, but in the future or present, I think it's even more important for us to understand tools, understand the style, the values, of communicating information to the intended audience.
Yeah, for sure. Joy, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, at first I thought, yeah, but for sure we need every single scientist to go through some specific training to be a better a better communicator, a better ability to distill technical information into several different ways for different audiences, right? But when I thought about it a little bit more, I realized it's a pretty special skill, I guess. And like you said, that right now there's definitely couple dozen gems in Western Canada right now anyway of people that just have a passion and have the ability to distill really complex information into a way that can be tangible and practical for farmers or even for policymakers or for other government officials in different ways, right? So I wonder if there's sort of a different model where there's, yes, scientists and science technical transfer people can maybe come part of the way and generate some additional skills over and above their research skills to translate information, but also continue to build on and invest in the next generation of those gems, those extension specialists that just have the passion for working with various technical people and various scientists to bring a whole bunch of information together in one place. Because if every scientist is doing that, now we have hundreds of scientists out there talking at producer meetings and field days and everything else versus having, those several dozen core people that are generalists but have a really good relationship with the science team to make sure that they have really relevant and up-to-date information.
Jake, is that what this all boils down to? That we have this massive amount of information being generated and we need to basically figure out the best way to, and the quickest way, most efficient way to get that information into a message that you can implement and information that you can act on the farm in your making decisions?
Yeah, I think that about nails it. I mean, there's an enormous volume of information. How do we actually utilize it? And I think another piece of this too is how do you get farmers to engage with it? You know, you could put 1,000 producer meetings on across Western Canada every year, but unless you're actually getting producers to come and engage, you know, the value is not going to be there. So communication is about more than just presenting information. It's about getting farmers to be interested in hearing that information, which is a whole different challenge altogether. And I would say it's one of the big issues, with this entire thing is, trying to get producer engagement. It's a challenge we've had with our own organization with SAS Wheat, and I think it's a challenge that's existed for extension for a long time, and I think that's maybe part of the reason for its erosion as well. There hasn't been that outcry from farmers to save it, at least not in a way that's maybe been visible enough. So, I think Joy mentioned the need for scientists to be communicators, and I think she raised a good point in that it's not a skill set everyone has. It's kind of like farmers are being told to tell their story. There's only a few farmers that are interested and good enough at doing that to be worthwhile. So you rely on the ones that are really good at it to fill in some of those gaps, and I guess hopefully that's enough to fill that gap in.
Kelvin, can I just quickly add to that, because
sure.
Jake actually is helping me make my point, I guess,
Yeah.
around producer engagement at these events really comes down to, is there, like you said, is there value for the producer? So if they're coming to an event and they're hearing some really engaging speakers, whether they're scientists or extension specialists or whoever, if it's information that they can use to improve their bottom line, they can see an ROI in their time spent listening to and engaging with these individuals, then they're going to engage, right? So I've always found the best way to get producer engagement is to actually put together some really good practical information for them to come absorb at an event. So that's just really the magic trick, I guess, is to find the best way to get really good practical information at those events and then get that producer engagement.
For sure.
Yeah, I just want to add to that point. I think I like the idea of that, probably not all scientists or researchers should be a good communicator. But the thing is that I think the value of science communication should be recognized. It's not always recognized in many disciplines, even in our TNP, system. So, I mean, even I might not be, I don't have to be a science communicator, but in my work, I can engage or involve or use those tools or resources available, and it should be, recognized and incentivized. So that's not the system in our, research or educational promotion system.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. No, I think there have been a lot of good points made here, and I'm not sure that there will be a revolution in extension in the next 5 years that we're going to see major change, but certainly a lot of different priorities that need to continue to be balanced here and continually assessed going forward in terms of how to best distill information for farmers and people implementing different agronomic practices and different practices on the farm, whether it's livestock or crops. Of course, livestock apply here as well. So thank you, all three of you, for taking the time to join us for this discussion about the future of extension here on the Ag Policy Connection.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelvin.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kelvin. Enjoyed it.